There is a particular kind of silence that exists in places where people used to be. It is not the silence of a forest that has never known human presence. That silence is clean and complete and belongs entirely to the natural world. It has no memory in it, no residue of anything human. It is just the forest being the forest, doing what forests do, in the absence of anything that walks upright and makes tools and leaves things behind. That silence is ancient and indifferent and in its own way deeply comforting, because it asks nothing of you and carries no weight. This is a different kind of silence. It is layered. It has texture. It carries within it the faint residue of voices and footsteps, and the clink of metal on metal, and the smell of wood smoke from fires that went cold over a century ago. It is the silence of absence, and once you learn to recognize it, you start finding it everywhere. In the slight depression in the hillside that used to be a cellar, in the line of stones barely visible under forest duff, in the way the vegetation changes at the edge of what was once a cleared area, you have to know how to look. And once you do, you cannot stop seeing it. The mountains of the Pacific Northwest are full of these ghosts, full of layered silences, full of places where people came and worked and struggled and sometimes succeeded and often failed and always eventually left. Left the mountains to quietly, methodically, without hurry or drama, erase every trace that anyone was ever there. We found it today in a big way. We've been tracking this site for a while, one of those locations that surfaces in old survey records or county mining reports or the occasional digitized historical newspaper. The historical record on this operation is patchy, the way it tends to be on small-scale mines that never made the papers. No big strikes, no dramatic collapses, no fortunes made in a single season, just steady, grinding, anonymous work by men whose names most of us will never know, pulling ore out of a mountain that gave it up slowly and reluctantly from roughly 1891 through the early 20th century. A copper and silver operation working a contact zone between two rock types where mineralization concentrates. The kind of geological setting that drew prospectors into every cascade drainage during the boom years of the 1880s and 1890s. A copper and silver operation primarily, working a contact zone between two different rock types, a boundary in the geology where fluids moving through the mountain over millions of years had deposited concentrated pockets of ore minerals, the kind of geological setting that drew prospectors into every drainage in this part of the Cascades during the boom years of the 1880s and 1890s, when the combination of improving transportation infrastructure, rising commodity prices, and the simple fact that most of the easily accessible ground in the older mining districts had already been claimed sent men pushing further and further into the backcountry, looking for the next big thing in places where the next big thing had never been looked for before. Most of them found nothing, or found something that turned out to be less than it appeared on the surface, a promising outcrop that played out after 20 feet of tunnel, a vein that pinched down to nothing before it ever justified the cost of the equipment needed to work it properly. The mountains of Washington are full of those too. The short prospect tunnels, the single adits driven hopefully into a hillside and then abandoned when the geology didn't cooperate. The maybe mines, the almost mines, the never quite mines. They're everywhere once you start looking, and each one represents someone's hope and someone's labor, and, more often than not, someone's loss. Most of them found nothing, or found something that turned out to be less than it appeared, a promising outcrop that played out after 20 feet, a vein that pinched down before it justified the cost of proper equipment. The mountains are full of those too, short prospect tunnels driven hopefully into a hillside and then abandoned. The maybe mines, the almost mines, the never quite mines. What we didn't expect, what genuinely surprised us when we got here, and after years of visiting these kinds of sites and learning not to expect too much, was how much was still there, how much had survived. And in one case in particular, how much the word abandoned turned out to be more complicated than we had assumed. But let's back up. Let's take our time with this one, because it deserves it. Let's talk about what a mining camp of this era actually looked like in practice, only because context matters, and I think the full picture makes what we found today considerably more meaningful. When most people picture a mining camp from the 1890s, they're probably drawing on some combination of Western films and vague school-era history lessons, a collection of tents, maybe a few rough log structures, men with beards and pickaxes, that sort of thing. And there's truth in that image, especially for the earliest stages of any operation. When the prospectors were still figuring out whether there was anything worth developing. But a mine that operated for any significant length of time, and this one operated for at least 15 years, possibly longer, looked considerably more like a small town than like a prospector's camp. It had to. The logistics of keeping men alive and productive in a remote mountain environment for months or years at a time demanded real infrastructure. And the operators who understood this were the ones whose mines actually produced. The ones who tried to cut corners on the basics, housing, food, equipment maintenance, were the ones who couldn't keep crews, and a mine without a crew is just a hole in the ground. So let's walk through what a real operation of this scale would have needed. Starting with housing. A crew of 10 to 15 men needed somewhere to sleep and somewhere to get out of the weather. In the Pacific Northwest, getting out of the weather is not optional. A winter in the Cascades will kill you if you're not adequately sheltered. A proper bunkhouse was essential. Log construction using locally available timber, a central stove, bunks lining the walls, whatever personal items the men had brought. Not comfortable by modern standards, but warm and dry and shelter. A proper bunkhouse was essential. Typically a rectangular structure, log construction using locally available timber. That's with a good tight roof and a central stove or multiple stoves depending on the size of the building. Bunks lining the walls, 2 tiers in most cases to maximize the use of space, a table or two for the evenings, maybe a few chairs. Whatever personal items the men had brought with them, photographs, books if they were readers, the occasional musical instrument. These buildings were not comfortable by modern standards. They were crowded and smoky, and the insulation was minimal, and the plumbing was non-existent. But they were warm, and they were dry, and they were shelter. And in the mountains of Washington, in November, that is enough. Then there's the cookhouse. On a larger operation, this might be a separate building from the bunkhouse, with a dedicated cook and full kitchen equipment. On a smaller operation, it might be a combined facility, one end of the bunkhouse converted into a cooking and eating area, separated from the sleeping quarters by a partition. Either way, feeding the crew was one of the most important operational functions of the mine, and the quality of the food was directly related to crew morale and crew retention. A good camp cook was worth his weight in gold. Literally, in some cases, a mine that couldn't keep its crew because the food was bad was a mine that wasn't producing ore, and that meant someone was losing money. The diet at a remote mining camp in the 1890s was heavy and caloric. Beans, salt pork, dried vegetables, sourdough bread, coffee. Fresh meat when hunting allowed it. Fresh vegetables were a seasonal luxury. The men burned enormous calories doing physical labor at altitude, and they needed to replace them. And what was available was what was cheap and what could be transported up the mountain on a mule without spoiling. The blacksmith shop was as critical to the operation as the mine itself. And the primary consumable in hard rock mining was drill steel, the hexagonal rods used to bore shot holes into the rock face. The bits wore and blunted constantly and needed resharpening on a forge multiple times per shift. A skilled blacksmith also maintained every other piece of iron equipment on the site, or car components, compressor fittings, horseshoes. The blacksmith shop was the beating mechanical heart of the operation. The powder magazine was its own concern, a small, solid structure at a safe distance from the other buildings, for storing the black powder and later the dynamite used for blasting. Handled according to procedures, learned the hard way over decades of mining history, usually by someone else. All of this adds up to a real settlement, small, isolated, rough, built from local materials by men improvising as they went. But a genuine human community with its own rhythms. Men ate together. I slept in the same building, worked the same shifts, told the same stories until everyone knew them by heart. They patched each other up when someone got hurt. It was a genuinely hard life, but it was a life. It was a hard life. A genuinely, seriously hard life in ways that are almost impossible to fully appreciate from the comfortable distance of the present. But it was a life, in the full human sense of that word, and the remains of that life are what we came out here today to find. Now, let's talk about how we got here, because the approach to this site is part of the story. The trailhead, such as it is, sits at the end of a Forest Service road that sees very little traffic in the best of times and essentially no traffic in the off-season. We were here on a weekday in late September, after the first cold snap of the fall had stripped some of the color from the vine maple and alder along the lower sections of the drainage, but before the first significant rain had turned the trail into the mud channel it becomes by October. The conditions were about as good as they get for this kind of exploration. Cool, dry, the light low and angled in the way it gets in the mountains in the fall, making shadows long and colors vivid, and everything looks slightly more dramatic than it does in the flat brightness of midsummer. The first mile and a half of the approach follows the creek drainage on a trail that is more accurately described as a corridor through the brush, slightly more passable than what's on either side of it. In places it disappears entirely, and you navigate by the sound of the creek. The alder is thick, the vine maple, beautiful in the fall when the leaves are turning orange and gold, is a complete nightmare to push through. After a mile and a half the gradient increases. The forest changes to older, heavier timber, Douglas fir and western red cedar with trunks 4 and 5 feet across, the canopy high and dense and cathedral-like. After the first mile and a half the gradient increases, the drainage steepens, and the creek becomes louder and more insistent, it dropping in small cascades over mossy ledges of bedrock. The forest changes character here. The alder and vine maple give way to larger, older timber, Douglas fir and western red cedar, that have been growing here since long before anyone knew there was ore in this mountain. These trees are huge. Some of them have trunks 4 and 5 feet in diameter, bark furrowed and thick. The root systems flared out at the base in massive buttresses that force you to detour around them. Their canopy is high and dense, and the light under them is green and dim and cathedral-like. You feel small in here? You're supposed to feel small in here. It's also in this section of the approach, about 2 miles in, that you start picking up the first signs of historical activity, subtle things easy to miss if you're not paying attention. A slight flattening of the terrain on a bench above the creek that is too regular to be entirely natural. A rusted iron object, unidentifiable at this distance, sitting in the fork of an old tree where it was presumably placed by someone many decades ago and never retrieved. The faintest trace of a cut in the hillside above the trail that might be the overgrown remnant of a water diversion ditch. These are the appetizers, the hints. The mountain's way of saying that something happened here without yet telling you what. And then, as you come around a bend in the creek about 2.5 miles from the trailhead, the site opens up in front of you. It is not dramatic in the way that a standing building is dramatic. There are no walls clearly visible from the trail, no obvious structures that announce themselves as human-made. What you see first is a change in the density and character of the forest, a slight opening in the canopy, trees that are younger and smaller than what surrounds them, growing up through what was once cleared ground, straight lines hiding in the undergrowth, if you know what to look for. the faint orange-brown of rust in the leaf litter. And the smell. That particular mineral, slightly sulfurous, slightly sweet smell that hangs around old mine sites and old building sites and tells your nose, even when your eyes aren't sure yet, that something was here. The first structure we came across was the bunkhouse. And I want to take some time with this one, because it's the most intact of the buildings we found today, and because what was inside it, what had survived inside it, deserves a careful telling. From outside, approaching through the undergrowth, the bunkhouse presents itself as a low mound at first. Then, as you get closer, the mound resolves, a corner of a log wall still upright, leaning slightly but unmistakably vertical. Then a second corner. Then a third. 3 of the 4 walls of this building are still standing, which is remarkable for a structure of this age in this climate. The logs are massive, old-growth Douglas fir, many 2 feet in diameter. That density is why they're still here. Old-growth timber of this quality resists rot in a way modern lumber cannot match. The roof is gone. The roof has been gone for a long time, judging by the trees that have grown up through the interior. A hemlock sapling that is no longer exactly a sapling, now about 15 feet tall, are coming up through what was once the floor of the building. A young cedar in the opposite corner, its roots already working their way under the log walls. The floor itself is largely intact, the puncheon flooring, rough-hewn split logs laid flat side up, still covering most of the interior, soft and punky in places, but still covering the ground. You can feel it flex slightly underfoot in the wetter areas near the walls. Walking through what used to be the doorway is a strange experience. The interior exists in temporal ambiguity, neither fully a building nor fully a forest, both simultaneously in the process of transitioning from one to the other. Ferns growing from between the floor logs are 3 feet tall. A hemlock sapling has come up through one corner, but the walls are still walls. The floor is still a floor. The geometry of the building is still legible, still organizing the space the way human-made structures organize space. And there was furniture. Not intact. Nothing survives intact after a century and a quarter in a roofless building in the Pacific Northwest. But unmistakable remnants. The iron frame of a bunk bed. The upper bunk collapsed onto the lower, but both still recognizable for what they were. The cast iron body of a wood stove sitting roughly in the center of the space where it had always stood, still upright after 100 years of freeze-thaw cycles and floor settling. And in the far corner, a wooden box, simple construction, square nails, no hardware, a storage chest approximately 3 feet long and 18 inches wide. In the corner farthest from the door, there was a wooden box. Simple construction. Square nails, rough-sawn lumber. No hardware beyond a simple wooden peg that served as a latch on the lid. The wood was dark and dry and friable at the edges. The kind of wood that crumbles when you press too hard on the corners, but holds its essential form in the thicker sections. It was, clearly and unmistakably, a storage chest. Approximately 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, maybe 1.5 feet deep. The kind of thing a man might keep his personal belongings in, or that the camp might have used for communal storage of smaller supplies and equipment. We opened it carefully, very carefully, because the lid was attached by 2 small iron hinges that had rusted to the point where any significant force would have broken them, and we wanted to avoid that. The lid came up slowly, reluctantly, with a sound, we are not making this up, something like a sigh, a release of air from a sealed space, the first exchange of atmosphere between the inside of that box and the outside world in who knows how many decades. Inside the box there was nothing dramatic. We want to be honest about that. No gold, no historical documents that would rewrite the history of the site, no artifacts that would make a museum curator reach for the phone. But there was something, and what there was is its own kind of remarkable. Inside the box there was nothing dramatic. No gold, no documents, nothing that would make a museum curator reach for the phone. But there was something. A folded piece of burlap sacking, deteriorated almost to disintegration, but still holding its rectangular shape. 2 glass bottles, both clear, both intact, both with applied lips that date them to before approximately 1905. A small pile of rusted iron objects, nails or tacks, too corroded to identify individually, and a leather strap, maybe 2 feet long, still supple in the thickest sections, cracked at the edges. Someone had packed these things carefully. Someone had closed the lid. And the box had held what it was given to hold for over 100 years. Someone packed these things into this box. Someone folded that burlap and laid it in carefully. Someone placed those bottles in with some consideration for keeping them intact. Someone closed the lid. And then that someone walked away, down the mountain, into a life that continued on without this box and these things in it. And the box sat in the corner of the bunkhouse through the collapse of the roof and the slow advance of the forest and the coming and going of 130 winters, and it held what it had been given to hold. We left everything exactly as we found it, lid open now, which it wasn't before, but everything inside undisturbed. The second structure was harder to identify at first. It sat about 40 feet from the bunkhouse, downhill and slightly to the east, and what remained of it was lower to the ground, more completely collapsed. On the walls down, and the whole thing compressed into a low mound of rotting timber and forest debris that at first glance read as nothing more than a natural feature of the terrain. But the footprint was wrong for a residential structure, too small in one dimension, too elongated in the other, and the orientation was off. It was positioned relative to the prevailing wind and the slope of the terrain in a way that made no sense for a building intended for human habitation, but made complete sense for a building intended for industrial work. And when we started carefully working through the debris on the surface, not excavating, not disturbing anything significantly, just moving aside the top layer of fallen leaves and small branches to see what was underneath, the artifacts that came to light told the story clearly and unambiguously. This was the blacksmith shop. The evidence was everywhere once we knew what we were looking at. Half buried in the debris, still in roughly the position it would have occupied when the building was standing, was the shell of a forge, a heavy cast-iron firepot sitting in the remains of a brick hearth. The brick was still there, most of it, the mortar long gone, but the brick still roughly stacked in the shape of a hearth. You could see where the bellows attachment fitting was, still present on the side of the firepot. Around the forge, yet distributed through the debris of the collapsed building in the way that tools get distributed when a building falls on top of them, were the implements of the trade. A hammerhead, large, maybe 3 pounds, with the distinctive shape of a cross-peen hammer, one face flat and round for general striking work, the opposite face coming to a horizontal wedge edge for drawing out and shaping hot metal. The handle was long gone, of course. Wood doesn't last the way iron does. But the head was there, complete, the peen still sharp-edged despite its rust coating, the geometry of a well-made tool still clearly readable. Several pieces of drill steel, hexagonal cross-section carbon steel rods designed to bore holes in rock. The bit ends on several of them had been reworked by the blacksmith. You could see where the original factory geometry had been overwritten by handwork, the metal heated in the forge and worked back into a cutting geometry on the anvil again and again. For however long this shop was running, a pair of tongs. The blacksmith's fundamental tool, the thing that lets you hold and maneuver hot metal that would otherwise be impossible to handle. These tongs were of a simple bolt jaw pattern, flat jaws designed to grip flat or square stock, with long handles that gave leverage and kept the user's hands away from the fire. The pivot rivet that connected the two halves of the tongs was still intact, still allowing the jaws to open and close, though with considerably more resistance than when they were new. You could work these tongs if you tried. They still functioned in the essential sense. And the anvil. The anvil is the centerpiece of the blacksmith shop in every sense. It is the largest, heaviest, most permanent object in the space, the fixed point around which all the work revolves. And this one was still there, still right where it had been placed when this shop was set up, probably in the early 1890s. Still sitting on the remains of what had been its stump mounting, the heavy section of log that served as the anvil's stand, now rotted down to a soft mound of brown fiber that was barely recognizable as wood anymore, but still supporting the anvil at the angle and height at which it had been positioned over a century ago. It is a pattern that we believe is a Fisher and Norris, based on the overall shape and proportions. The double horn configuration was not standard for Fisher and Norris, which typically produced single horn anvils, but the body shape and the proportions of the face and the heel are consistent with their work. The manufacturer's markings, if there are any on the underside, are inaccessible without moving the anvil, which we were not about to do. But the shape tells a story on its own. This is a quality anvil. Not a cheap imitation, not a cast iron substitute for the real thing, but a properly made tool steel face anvil of the kind that a serious operation would purchase and use for serious work. It weighs something in the range of 150 to 200 pounds. That is why it is still here. That is the only reason it is still here, because nobody at any point in the long history of this site's abandonment wanted to carry a 200-pound anvil down 2.5 miles of rough mountain trail. It was too heavy to steal, too heavy to salvage. I'm too heavy to do anything with except leave it exactly where it was. And so it stayed. And the building around it collapsed, and the forest grew in, and the decades passed, and the anvil sat in the ruins of the blacksmith shop exactly as it had always sat, waiting for someone to build a fire in the forge next to it and put metal on its face and get to work. The surface of the anvil is pitted with rust. The face, the working surface, has lost some of its original flatness to corrosion, though less than you'd expect for a piece of steel that has been sitting exposed to the weather for so long. Under the rust, under the pitting, the essential nature of the thing is unchanged. You could clean this anvil. You could wire brush it down, treat the surface, dress the face, and put it in a working blacksmith shop today, and it would do its job. It would do its job exactly as well as it did its job on the day it arrived at this camp. I carried up the mountain at considerable effort and expense by men who understood that a good anvil was not a luxury, but a necessity. There is something about an anvil that communicates permanence in a way most objects don't. Its entire purpose is to resist force, to be the fixed point against which everything else is shaped. An anvil in a forest is not a ruin, it is just an anvil that happens to be in a forest, unchanged and undiminished, waiting. We stayed at the anvil for a while. There's no practical reason for that. We had documented what we needed to document. But there are moments in this work when you just need to stop and be present with something, and the anvil was one of those moments. The third structure was the most unexpected, the one that gave this video its title. And we want to tell that story carefully because it deserves it. It sat further from the main cluster of buildings than we would have expected, maybe 80 feet uphill from the bunkhouse. I'm tucked into a slight depression in the hillside that would have given it some shelter from the prevailing westerly weather. From the main site area looking uphill, it didn't register as a structure at all, just another mound in the forest floor, the kind of irregular undulation in the terrain that you learn to read as potential evidence of historical activity, but that could equally be a completely natural feature. A fallen tree that rotted down over decades, a boulder with accumulated debris around it, any number of things. But when we got closer, something was different. The vegetation on the mound was not the same as on the surrounding forest floor. There were fewer ferns growing on the top of it. The moss on the surface was slightly different in character, less of the thick cushion moss that typically colonizes fallen wood, and more of a flatter, drier type that grows on surfaces that don't retain as much moisture. And there was a smell, faint, but unmistakable once you caught it, the dry, mineral, slightly resinous smell of old wood that has been protected from direct moisture for a long time, protected, not just aged. There's a difference, and your nose knows it, even when you can't immediately articulate why. This structure had a roof, or the remains of one, not a standing, functional roof, but its skeleton, collapsed and compressed downward in a slow subsidence rather than a catastrophic failure. The boards were still present, the rafters still in rough position. The whole assembly had settled into a low tent over the interior, angled and compressed, but still shedding water rather than letting it in. The result was that the contents of this space had been protected from the worst of the weather for a significant portion of the time since the camp was abandoned. We worked our way around the perimeter of the structure, looking for the entrance. Found it on the south side, a low opening, more like a hatch than a proper doorway, with a heavy timber threshold that had survived remarkably well. The opening was partially blocked by a section of wall log that had fallen outward, and we spent some time carefully assessing whether we could move it without destabilizing anything significant. The assessment took longer than the actual work. Once we understood the structural situation, the log came out cleanly and the rest of the structure didn't shift. Inside. The interior was small, maybe 8 feet wide by 10 or 12 feet long, with a ceiling that, in its current compressed state, was low enough that you could not stand fully upright. The floor was earth, not wood. This was not a finished structure in the same sense as the bunkhouse. Earthen floor, rough walls, minimal framing. A utilitarian space built for function rather than comfort. And it was dry, significantly, noticeably, almost startlingly dry, are relative to everything else we had been in and around at this site. The collapsed roof structure, in the particular way it had failed, slowly, in stages, each stage partially stabilizing before the next one began, had ended up functioning as a reasonably effective rain shed. Not perfect, not completely dry, but dry enough that the contents of this space had been protected from the worst of the weather for what appeared to be a substantial portion of the time since the camp was abandoned. Yeah, maybe not all of it, but enough. The contents. Along the back wall there were wooden crates, 8 or 9 of them in various states of preservation, some intact, some partially collapsed, some compressed to flat layers of gray fiber on the floor. Standard commercial crate construction, stenciled markings on the sides in black paint, most too faded to read. Supply crates, provisions. On the kind of thing you stockpiled at a remote camp to buffer against the unpredictability of resupply runs down the mountain. Among the crates there were glass jars, at least 8, possibly more buried under debris, some intact, some cracked at the base. Wide-mouthed jars of the kind used for preserves or canned vegetables, sealed with wax or early rubber gasket lids. The contents of all of them were long since gone or transformed beyond recognition. Someone had put up food in these jars, or had sealed them and packed them here, expecting they'd be used through the coming winter. They weren't used. The camp was abandoned and the jars were not opened, and they sat here for over 100 years. There were also larger commercial tins, the kind used for bulk goods like lard or kerosene. Most had rusted through completely, but one was still holding recognizable form, and on its side, where it had been partially sheltered from direct moisture by its position against the wall, under there was stenciled text, faded, partially obscured, but readable in good light with patience. A brand identifier speaking from over 130 years away. We read it. We won't reproduce the exact text here because we want to do more research before making any definitive claims about the brand or supplier. But it was there. Commercial text, a brand identifier of some kind, speaking from a tin container across a gap of over 130 years. Someone ordered this product. Someone transported it up the mountain. Someone stacked it in this supply cache. And it has been sitting here ever since, holding its label with the same stubbornness with which the anvil holds its shape and the log walls hold their position. And then, in the far corner of the structure, farthest from the entrance, partially buried under a section of collapsed wall material that we carefully lifted and set aside, there was something that stopped us completely. On something that we needed a moment to fully process before we could respond to it. A pair of boots. Work boots. Heavy leather, lace-up, hobnailed soles. Standard footwear for hard rock miners of the 1890s, designed for traction on wet rock. The leather had dried and hardened to something approaching wood. You could tap on it with a knuckle and get a sound that was closer to knocking on a plank than touching leather. The laces were gone, the soles separating from the uppers. But these were boots, completely and unmistakably, sitting on the floor in approximately the position they would have been in if someone had sat on a crate and unlaced them and set them down, side by side. They were sitting there as if someone had taken them off, as if someone had sat down in this small, dark space at the end of a long shift or at the end of the last day before the camp closed down and pulled off their boots and set them down here, maybe meaning to come back and get them, and maybe deliberately leaving them, too worn to be worth carrying down the mountain, useful still to whoever might come after. Maybe just doing what people do at the end of a hard day, setting down the heaviest things first, without thinking about whether they'd need them tomorrow. They didn't come back for the boots, or if they did, they decided the boots weren't worth it, and left them again. And the boots stayed in the small, dry space under the collapsing roof, and the years went by, and the decades went by, and the forest grew higher, and the moss spread further, and the mountain kept its silence, and the boots sat in the corner and waited. There is no way to know who these boots belong to, no name written inside them. We looked carefully. No identifying marks, just boots, just a size and a shape and a construction style that tells us approximately when they were made and what kind of work they were made for, and nothing whatsoever about the man who wore them. He wore through the soles, probably. He had these boots resoled at least once, maybe twice, because miners wore through boots at a rate that would seem extraordinary to anyone who has never done physical labor on rough terrain for 12 hours at a stretch. He wore them until they were worn, and then he left them. We left them exactly where they were. We spent more time at this site than we planned. Much more time. The light was well into its late afternoon shift by the time we finished documenting the third structure and started making our way back down the drainage toward the trailhead. The forest was doing what Pacific Northwest forest does in that particular quality of autumn afternoon light, going golden and still and slightly unreal, the long shadows from the massive firs stretching across the ground and the creek catching the slant light in small, bright flashes between the boulders. It was beautiful in the specific way that wilderness is beautiful when you've been inside human history for a few hours and you come back out into the natural world and it hits you fresh. We walked carefully, paying attention, because the approach trail is tricky in low light, and we'd already had one near miss with a concealed route crossing on the way in. But we were also talking, the kind of talking that happens at the end of a good day in the field, the processing conversation, where you work through what you found and what it means and what questions it raises and what you want to come back and look at more carefully. On the way back, following the line of the old pack trail where it was still faintly legible in the vegetation, we came across something that we had walked right past on the way in without noticing. It was small, and it was off the trail far enough that it didn't register in the forward-focused attention of the approach. But coming back the other way, With the light different and our attention pattern different, we caught it. A single object sitting on top of a mossy boulder about 30 feet from the trail, half concealed by a low-hanging cedar branch. We stopped. We looked. We worked our way through the undergrowth to get a better view. It was a tin cup. Granite ware, that distinctive speckled blue and white enamel that was ubiquitous in outdoor and camp settings from roughly the 1880s through the early 20th century. Used everywhere from military camps to logging operations to mining camps precisely because it was cheap, durable, lightweight, and resistant to breakage in the way that ceramic was not. A granite ware cup in a mining camp was like a smartphone today. Everyone had one. Nobody thought about it particularly. It was just part of the basic material fabric of daily life. The enamel on this cup was chipped in several places, especially around the rim where the chips tend to accumulate from contact with other objects. The metal underneath the enamel at the rim showed a rust line. The handle was still attached, the attachment rivet still holding, the handle itself still functional. The cup was complete. No cracks in the enamel significant enough to have compromised its function, no holes in the bottom. It was, by the standards of the objects we had been looking at all day, in excellent condition. It was sitting on top of that boulder as if someone had set it there deliberately, not dropped, not fallen, set there, placed, with the kind of casual intentionality with which you set something down when you're done with it and expect to pick it up again shortly. The moss around the base of the cup told a different story. The moss had grown up around the base of the cup, not just around it in the sense of surrounding it, around it in the sense of enclosing it partially, the moss creeping up the sides of the cup for perhaps 1/4 of an inch in the areas where the enamel surface provided enough texture for it to take hold. Moss grows slowly, very slowly. The kind of encroachment we were looking at represents years of growth, minimum. Decades, more likely. This cup had been on this boulder for a very long time. Nobody put it there recently. Nobody put it there in our lifetimes. Someone put it there deliberately, carefully, with the intention of coming back for it sometime in the early part of the 20th century or possibly earlier, and then they didn't come back. Or they came back once and left it again. Or they forgot it was there. We don't know. We won't know. We left it on the boulder, exactly where it has been for longer than any of us has been alive, exactly where whoever put it there last touched it and turned away, and walked down the mountain and did not return. That cup is going to be on that boulder after we're gone too. There is a version of this hobby, this practice of going to old places and documenting what's there, that is purely about the objects, the artifacts, the thrill of discovery, the visual interest of historical material, the intellectual puzzle of identification and dating and provenance. And that version is legitimate, and we participate in it fully. The objects are fascinating. The identification work is genuinely interesting. The history embedded in a drill steel or an anvil or a granite ware cup is real history, worth knowing and worth preserving. But there is another layer to this work that is harder to articulate. It has to do with the people, the specific, irreducible, individual human beings who lived and worked in these places, who packed a wooden chest and closed the lid, who took off their boots at the end of the day, who set a cup on a boulder and walked away. We don't know their names. History doesn't have room for most of them, but they were here. Their hands touched these objects, their feet wore these boots. The camp has been holding their presence for over 100 years, not in any mystical sense, but in the concrete physical sense of objects that persist and spaces that remember. But they were here. Their hands touched these objects. Their feet wore these boots. Their work shaped this ground. The camp they built and lived in and left behind has been holding their presence for over 100 years in the way that places hold the presence of the people who inhabited them, not in any mystical sense, but in the concrete, physical sense of objects that persist and spaces that remember. The camp wasn't as abandoned as we thought. not because anyone is still using it, not because anyone is coming back, but because the things they left are still here, still present. Us still keeping a kind of faith with the people who handled them last, who used them and then left this mountain and never came back. We'll come back. There's more here. A fourth structure that we identified from the surface but didn't have time to properly investigate before the light started failing. A section of collapsed ore chute that runs down the hillside from above the main camp area toward the creek. The wooden components almost entirely gone, but the roots still legible in the terrain. And somewhere in this drainage, according to the old records, a lower tunnel, a second portal driven into the hillside at a lower elevation, possibly to intercept the ore zone at a deeper level. We didn't find it today. We'll look for it next time. There is always a next time with places like this. They give you something every visit. They don't give you everything at once. They make you come back. And every time you come back, they're a little different. The seasons have changed. The light is different. Something has fallen that was standing before. Something has been revealed that was hidden before. These places are not static. They are in the process of becoming something else, slowly and inevitably. And every time you visit, you're seeing a different frame of that process. Thanks for coming along on this one. If you've been to places like this, if you know this part of the mountains, if you have any information about this operation or others like it, drop it in the comments. Every piece of context helps build a more complete picture, and a more complete picture is what these places and the people who made them deserve. We'll see you on the next one.